we are very grateful to Tockwotton for hosting us for the last 4 or 5 years here at Pokanoket Square Days, where we take over their cafe, and then we do our follow-up program here in the theater.
Come and join me here at the table. We hope to have some slides up before too long. As Nancy said, I'm Dave Weed. I've been part of a project for the last year in bringing forth a new historical district, if you will, the Sowams Heritage Area. And as Nancy explained earlier, this is an area that runs really all the way from the Taunton River over to the Seekonk River and all the way up to Rehoboth. You can see on the map and in the brochures that we handed out, there are over 50 locations that we've identified, all connected to the 17th century. And we've got a poster like the one that you see up there to illustrate some of the places that all of us can see that bring up the 17th century to life. What was going on here 12,000 years ago? People were moving into this area because it was a wonderful, and still is, a wonderful place to live. What made it wonderful? The access to the water in the back, the access to the land and hunting, and cleared areas where people could grow crops. So the people who first moved into this area after the glaciers receded knew that this was the place to live. And it was a very successful life until some people arrived here from Europe who had never been here before and didn't really understand the people who they were displacing as they came. The map up in the upper left shows the names, the Indian names. It's the same map that's behind Carl there. And the people who lived here, the Native Americans, the first people who lived here, had their own names for every part of this area because they knew this area like the back of their hands. They knew where to go for food and where to live and how to travel from place to place. In particular, using all the rivers and access points here. That's what made this place such a great place to live. This was land occupied by the Pokanoket Tribe. We haven't heard the word Pokanoket for a long time. We hear the word Wampanoag. Well, Wampanoag was the name given to the native people who lived here after the King Philip War. And Carl's going to talk a little bit about that war. But it's only been recently that the Pokanoket people have begun to use the name Pokanoket. There are many tribes in this area. As I just explained, the Wampanoag are really the Pokanoket. The Narragansetts you're probably more familiar with. The Pequots, everybody knows about the casino. Okay? And the Nipmuc, okay? And then the Massachusetts tribe north of here. Those were the major large tribes in the area, though there were many sub-tribes. These people lived successfully in this area. Over 100,000 people in New England living over this period of time successfully. And they began trading in the 1500s, long before the Pilgrims arrived. Unfortunately, though they were able to trade furs for European goods like knives and axes, things that they didn't have here. Unfortunately, some of those traders who came here also brought something that people didn't want. They brought contagious diseases. And between 1616 and 1690, over 90% of the people who lived along the coast, the Massachusetts coastline, were died in that period of time. Whole villages were completely wiped out. Nothing but bones because the people who were there couldn't bury the dead. We've heard of this man here, Massasoit. That's the name meaning chief. His name was Osamequin, or Yellow Feather. That's the statue of what some people think he looked like, though we don't have any pictures, obviously, from the 1600s. And this is a more contemporary painting of him in a red jacket and copper necklace that was given to him by Winslow, one of the pilgrims on the Mayflower. In fact, it was the agreement that was made in March of 1621, following that horrible winter where half of the Mayflower people died. The ones remaining struck an agreement with Massasoit that lasted for 50 years until his death in 1661 that guaranteed their survival. If it hadn't been for the native people here, none of us would be here, and we'd probably be speaking French or Dutch or something else. Okay? Things would have been very different. We're all familiar with Plymouth Plantation, okay, which shows the kind of village that might have been set up around Plymouth. You can still see some of the houses, like the Richard Sparrow House, from that period of time in Plymouth. So we get some idea of what those original colonists were like. 16 years later, somebody named Roger Williams. How many people have heard of Roger Williams? Okay, good. Now I know how many people are still awake. Okay. Roger, of course, came down from Salem and spent time with Osamequin here in Sowams, probably on Tyler Point in Barrington. We don't know for sure, but we do know that his survival depended on the support he got from the Massasoit because they sheltered him in something called Margaret's Cave, just over the Swansea line north of Warren, and that allowed him to live until April when he moved not far from here. Remember, he crossed the Seekonk River in a boat and started Providence. This is a artist's rendering of what Providence might have looked like in 1650. It's a small village, by the way. Newport was where all the action was. But around here, how many people have heard of the Newman Church? Okay, the Ring of the Green, right. This is our neighborhood. 1643, group from Weymouth came down to settle, and for the purpose of religious freedom, they were able to worship in a way that they were not allowed to in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. So they began building houses around here and acquired land from the Native Americans and started the first settlement in this area. Some of those you can see. Anybody familiar with 1527 Pawtucket Avenue? All right. I didn't know until Nancy told me. That house is from 1700. It's the oldest house from the Ring of the Green still around at that time period. But the Daggett House, if you're familiar with that, 1690. And then over here, the Philip Walker House. Those are three houses from that period of time. Of course, none of the houses survived the King Philip War, and Carl's going to talk some more about the King Philip War in 1675. The thing that began the war were these folks, cows and pigs and sheep. Because what did they do? They ate the crops that the native people were growing. And how would you like it if you put all that work into growing your corn and beans and squash, and the next thing you'd wake up some morning and some pigs have ravaged your entire planting? You wouldn't be happy, and neither were the people who were living here. That became a source of irritation for over 30 years when people were not able to come to an agreement about how to keep their animals where they should be. And some people have even said that the colonists used their animals to expand their territory. Oh, that's too bad. We ate your crops. Let's move in. So that pressure from the colonists began to work against the people who were living here for 12,000 years and led to a conflict. After that conflict, we have the colonists moving into this area. Okay, you all know India Point? Right across from here, you can look out the window and look at it. Okay, that became a trading area with John Brown as early as 1680 when he began trading with East India and West India, there by India Point. We don't have pictures from that time. There weren't any cameras, but we at least have some more recent pictures of what that area that you're looking at when you walk out of this building must have looked like at that time. It remained a trading area until relatively recently. It wasn't until the 1970s that it was turned into a park. Well, if you're wondering whatever happened to the Pokanokets, even though we had a war and we tried to get rid of everybody, I mean, there were serious efforts to make sure that there weren't any Native Americans who said they were Native American still living here. In fact, they were. And they continue to live here. And here's the Pokanoket Tribal Council today. Okay, there are over 200 Pokanokets, people of ancestry with Pokanoket, including this guy right here, William Guy, who's the 10th descendant of Massasoit. Okay. This was at our launch event for the Sowams Heritage Area, and several tribal members, including some that are, go to Mount Hope in Bristol to do some of their ceremonial activities. So I'm going to stop here. Carl's going to pick up the next 10 minutes and talk about what happened to get us here in terms of the Native Americans.
Well, let me go back to one of David's previous points. Is I was on a hayride with my granddaughter, and as we're going around Escobar Farm, there was one cow that got loose. And there was a big effort to get that one cow, and the woman indicated to us, one cow will destroy an entire cornfield. One. It will eat until it cannot eat anymore. And it will destroy, that's why there was a full court press in terms of getting that one cow so it wouldn't destroy their entire fields. So about a year ago, I was on the Rosebud Indian Reservation in South Dakota volunteering, and that was about the same time that Standing Rock was going on. And to refresh your memory, there was a oil pipeline that was originally planned to be 10 miles north of Bismarck, North Dakota, and the population of Bismarck moaned and complained, 90% of which were white, and they decided to move the pipeline to within 1 mile of the Indian reservation. And so the Indians at Standing Rock were standing up to protest against this pipeline being there. But at the time we were hearing this information, there was something mentioned about Episcopal ministers burning the Doctrine of Discovery. Now, I had 16 years of Catholic education, 8 of which were Jesuit. I had never heard of the Doctrine of Discovery. And basically the Doctrine of Discovery is it was a papal bull put forth by Alexander, Pope Alexander VI, at the urging of Ferdinand and Isabella, coincidentally in 1493, which indicated that the Catholic faith and Christian religion be exalted and everywhere increased and spread, that the health and souls be cared for, that the barbarous nations be overthrown and brought to the faith itself. So basically, the land that was discovered by Christian explorers now were able to be acquired from the heathens to the benefit of the Christians. This became the spiritual impetus for taking over this new world. And so, going to flip to the next one here, I think. So as David mentioned, in 1616 to 1619 is when this disease came and wiped out a good portion of the Pokanokets, 90%. The Pequots, the Narragansetts, the Mohegans were spared that until 1633, where at least 50% of their people were wiped out by a disease that some claim is leptospirosis, which is a disease brought through by the traders through rats, rat urine. Others think it may be some sort of hepatitis, but in any event, no matter what the scourge is, it wiped out a good number of the people. Now, between 1620 and 1637, the colonists realized that this farming is labor intensive because the natives worked cooperatively. They planted together, they harvested together, the women all worked together, planting the fields, maintaining the fields, and harvesting the fields. The men worked cooperatively hunting and fishing, the way English plots were set up. Each individual would work his own land. He had to build his own house. He had to clear his own field. He had to build his own walls. He had to cut his own wood. And what they found out in this ensuing 17 years is they needed labor. And so, under the pretense of Englishmen who had captured some Native Americans, and Native Americans responded, they entered an alliance with the Narragansetts and the Mohegans against the Pequots. What the Mohegans and the Narragansetts were able to get out of this was that the Pequots and the Dutch controlled the fur and wampum trade up the rivers, the Mystic, the Thames, and the Connecticut. And the Narragansetts and the Mohegans wanted that control. The colonists wanted the labor. And so this war was brought. And one of the things that happened in this war was something called the Mystic Massacre, where in Mystic, Connecticut, there was a settlement of Native Americans. A handful of warriors, because Sassacus had taken his warriors and gone to Fairfield, mostly women and children. And so what the British did was they lit the village on fire. And as the women and children were escaping the fire, they shot them all, killed them all. The Narragansetts were so disgusted that they left, never to ally with the English again. This was a concept new to Native Americans, total war that the Europeans were accustomed to. Prior to this, Native Americans fought each other via guerrilla warfare, a few people dying at a time, but nothing of this total war. And interestingly enough, when King Philip's War started, the Great Swamp Fight was the exact replica of the Mystic Massacre, where a Native American led the British, the colonists, to the Great Swamp, which is very difficult to find. I've tried to find it. I found it by kayak accidentally. And it was primarily women, children, and elderly. They burnt the entire village and shot the women and children as they left. Interesting, ironic that the Narragansetts would be involved in this. But interesting, subsequent to the Pequot War, slaves were acquired. Narragansetts got some, and the Mohegans got some, and the colonists got some, that created that now solved their labor problem. Now they had indentured servants, and interesting enough, there was a committee that determined who amongst them of the Allies got what slaves, and that committee was headed by Roger Williams, who was himself a slave owner. Read him in weeks, sorry to say. So now we move once again now to the King Philip War that David alluded to. This encroachment by the animals, this encroachment by the colonists, this constant back and forth, the lands being usurped by the colonists, led Philip to this war. And once again, we go back to the primary reasons for this conflict. By clearing the land of natives, you have free labor. Subsequent to the King Philip War, there were over 2,000 Native Americans that were in servitude, that were captured or that surrendered. And as a result, that was more than they actually needed for their labor in the colony, and so now a new industry was developed. Now you could sell these people. And one of the quotes is, "I'd rather die on the battlefield than be Barbados." And so they were sold, some to Fayal in the Azores, which gives some Portuguese, some Native American blood. The other through Bermuda and Barbados itself. Yes. And so now, it's New England that's the birthplace of slavery, not the South. Right here. Right in Rhode Island, they got a slower start because Peter Faneuil and Isaac Royal Jr. were the Massachusetts slave traders, but right here, we had John Brown and James DeWolf. James DeWolf, when he died in 1837, was the second richest man in America from running slaves. John Brown, you may recognize as the man who gifted the land to Brown University. Now, the industry in our area was slave trading. The entire town of Bristol developed their economy around the slave trade. Boats were built in Bristol. They were outfitted in mooring. People bought shares in DeWolf and Brown's expeditions. They were expecting 25% on their money. It started with Native Americans. There was a triad. They would be run through Bermuda, Barbados, sold on the in Africa, or traded in Africa, because it started trading Native Americans for Africans, bringing them to Cuba, and then they would produce molasses and sugar, which would be brought up here, developed into rum. The rum sold in Africa to buy slaves to bring them to Cuba, for the molasses and the sugar, shipped back up here to create the molasses. There was money made on every leg of this trade. And this is the legacy that unfortunately, we live with. It started with Native Americans. Native Americans were quickly converted to Africans. They were actually at times traded for Africans because Native Americans were untrustworthy, the men, because they could escape and live in the land. When the Africans got here, they had nowhere to go. And that's how slavery began. The South got branded with it, but it was here that it all began. Faneuil Hall was a holding area for the slaves before they were shipped out in Massachusetts. The custom houses in Newport, same thing. In Bristol, conveniently, when Thomas Jefferson was president, at the urging of James DeWolf, who was a senator at the time, appointed his brother-in-law to be the customs official in Bristol. And conveniently, when certain ships went in and out, he was unavailable. So the question of the day is this: what do Brown University, Roger Williams University, and Harvard University have in common? The land upon which they are located are all donated by slave traders. Isaac Royal Jr. donated the land at Harvard. John Brown donated the land at the Brown University Corporation. James DeWolf, Roger Williams University. And all of this began when the Native Americans were taken into slavery and servitude, because they had a mandate, a spiritual mandate by the Pope. They had the mandate of the Doctrine of Conquest, where we take the land from these people, we clear the land of people, and we have the land for ourselves. And as the DeWolf family members would say, Brown, Royal, Faneuil, DeWolf, it was wrong. They knew it was wrong. They did it anyway. So you can all be welcome to Rhode Island, right?
Well, thank you, Carl. And as difficult as some of this is to learn about and understand, nothing will change until we do understand how things came about here. On a more positive note,
I'm glad I didn't end this.
I've asked Rock, who I've gotten to know from the Warren Conservation Land Trust, to talk about another aspect of the Sowams Heritage Area, not just about history and not just about rewriting the history of Native Americans here, but we're also about conserving land. So, Rock, if you would fill us in for a few minutes about how we're going to maintain the land that we once had and preserve it for future generations.
Okay. I'm on the board of the Foreign Land Conservation Trust, and we have decided that one of the things we want to do is to recognize the traditions of the native people who lived on this land, and they lived as one with the land, and in a sustainable way. And we're honored to be acting as stewards of these properties, and we're going to try to maintain them as close to their natural state as possible. So our land trust was founded in 1987. We currently have about 170 acres of land in Warren under preservation. These areas, these green areas on our map. And we're a private nonprofit organization. We don't have a lot of money to buy land outright, but we work with the owners of properties in various ways to help them find a way to preserve and conserve their land rather than make it available for development and building. And there is quite a lot of open land still in this area, and so we've been working in various ways. One of the ways that we've been able to do it is working with the federal government. The Department of Agriculture has a program called the Natural Resource Conservation Service, and they help landowners find ways to put development easements or conservation easements on their properties to keep them from being developed. And there's actually ways that the federal government will help pay for placing these easements on people's property. And what happens then is that people, once they have gotten some return on these properties and they don't want them to be developed, oftentimes then they donate that property to a land trust. Then they can get some tax benefits from doing that as well. So there are benefits to preserving the land, and we try to work with people to make them see how this can work to their advantage, and also then to the advantage of the community by preserving the land. And it's really important, as Dave and Carl have been talking about the history of this area. These lands, these open lands, were the reason that people wanted to live here, as David said. This was a rich, area. The seafood, the shellfish, the fertile land for crops, the salt marshes. With the salt marsh hay, it was a huge business to harvest that hay that no one had to plant. It was there for the taking. And so these properties were, important properties in supporting the lifestyle of the Native Americans who lived here before the Europeans arrived, and also became rich resources for the colonists as well. And we think it's really important to preserve the land, not just for the historical reason, because this is land that was here and untouched for years. And it'd be great to preserve it for that reason alone. But also there's the environmental side of things. It's really important to save these salt marshes and the related wetlands. These are nature's natural defenses against storm surge.
Thank you very much. You've been very attentive.